All right, our story this week is called We Were There Too. It's on page 449 in your reading book. This is a biography, which means it's written about a person or about people, but they were not the people to write the book. Okay, so this is actually going to be, I believe this story actually, if you bought the real book, We Were There Too, I believe it has 72 different stories in it, okay, about 72 different people. And it talks about and teaches about American history through the biography of those 72 people. Today, in our reading book, they focus on two of those people, which one of them, the first one that we're going to read about is Joseph Plum Martin. And the second person that we are going to read about is Sybil Ludington. So I am on page 450. The smell of war began to be pretty strong. So we're going to continue talking about the American Revolution. And remember, this is the war before America was actually its own country. They were still colonies of Britain. Therefore, they decided to fight for their own independence and to become their own country. And remember, this is that war where they were the complete underdogs. They were not supposed to win, and they were fighting the most powerful army in the entire world at that time. Joseph Plum Martin, and now I was a soldier. Milford, Connecticut, 1775. Joseph Plum Martin was a tall, strong, hardworking boy who grew up on his grandparents' farm in Connecticut. Though he never went to school, he managed to write one of the best diaries of the entire Revolutionary War. Joseph Martin forced the metal plow deep down into the soil while his grandfather walked alongside, guiding the horse that pulled it. It was a fresh April morning, a perfect planting day. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of bells and gunshots in Milford. Joseph dropped the plow and dashed into the town, and his grandfather followed behind as fast as he could. A crowd was gathered in front of the tavern, where an express rider from New Haven shouted news of 3 days before. There had been a bloody battle in Concord, Massachusetts. Many people were dead. Soldiers are needed, and they're needed now. There's going to be a silver dollar rewarded for anyone who would enlist in the American Army and march off to New York to join General Washington. So once again, history is boring unless you think about it with your emotions. This was a boy, and I don't think we said how old he was yet, but he was young. And he heard this craziness. He heard this, and he dashed into the news, and he heard this brand new news. And all they're thinking is there's going to be a bloody war. And you guys know about the Boston Massacre. That's obviously what he's talking about. He's telling about the Boston Massacre. And now all of a sudden, they're saying, you know, imagine if that happened here in Woodhaven or something. It's crazy to think about. And he's saying, hey, anyone that wants to go and join what we're calling the American Army, you will get a silver dollar. Joseph was only 14 years old, a year too young to actually join. 14, wow. Until that day, his thoughts about soldiering had always been clear. I felt myself to be a real coward. What venture my carcass where bullets fly? That will never do for me. I'm going to stay at home out of harm's way, thought I. So that's what he's saying. He's like, I'm never going to be a soldier. I don't want to do that. I'm not going to go and risk death and go and fight out there. But now he has friends his age and even younger that were scrawling their names and grabbing up those dollars while adults cheered. Joseph was torn. He hated to stay home while his friends marched off to glory, and the thought of a whole silver dollar made the seeds of courage begin to sprout. But he needed more time to get used to the idea. So 2 months later, he was ready. On June 25th, 1776, Joseph slipped away from his grandparents' house and hiked into town. His mind made up to enlist for 6 months, the shortest term possible. When a group of boys he knew saw him coming, they began to make fun of him, taunt him. Come, if you will enlist, I will, says one. You have long been talking about it, says another. Come on now, it's time. Well, I guess that's not necessarily making fun of him, but taunting him, like, come on, let's do it, come on. Try to talk him into it. Regulars, unlike the militia or the militiamen who volunteered to fight when men were needed, the Continentals or regulars were professional soldiers who got paid to enlist and fight in the army. Continentals and militiamen often fought together in battle. Each Continental soldier got assigned to a company of 86 men. 8 companies made up a regiment, also called a battalion. The Continental Army had 26 of them, of regiments, of foot soldiers, one of the riflemen, and 1 artilleryman. So just different kinds of guns. Thinks I to myself, I will not be laughed into it or out of it. I will act my own pleasure after all. So, seating myself at the table, enlisting orders were immediately presented to me, and I took up the pen. I loaded it with the fatal charge, and I made several mimic imitations of writing my name, but took especially care not to touch the papers with the pen until an unlucky friend who was leaning over my shoulder gave me a hand strike, which caused the pen to make a woeful scratch on the paper. Oh, he has enlisted, said he. Well, thought I may as well go through with the business now as not. So I wrote my name fairly upon the indentures, and now I was a soldier, in name at least. His grandparents were very unhappy, but if they fit him out with clothing, a musket, and powder, his grandmother gave him cheese and cake and stuffed it into his knapsack. He sailed to New York City to join a Connecticut company. For more than a month, all they did was march in parades and practice battle drills. Joseph's biggest problem was getting used to the food: salt pork or boiled beef, hard bread and turnips or boiled potatoes. But even as they practiced, hundreds of British warships were arriving at nearby Staten Island, unloading 32,000 red-coated soldiers. Late in August, Joseph's company was ordered to Long Island to stop the British forces from taking New York City. Just before they marched off, Joseph climbed onto the roof of a house and squinted in the direction of the battlefield. I distinctly saw the smoke of the field artillery, but the distance and the unfavorableness of the wind prevented my hearing their report, at least but faintly. The horrors of battle then presented themselves to my mind in all their hideousness. I must come to it now, I thought. They took a ferry across the East River to Brooklyn and marched towards a field, the shots growing louder and louder with each step until they boomed like thunder. We now began to meet the wounded men, another sight I was unacquainted with, some with broken arms and some with broken heads. The sight of these a little daunted me and made me think of home. And then all at once, he was fighting too. Our officers pressed forward towards a creek where a large party of Americans and British were engaged. By the time we arrived, the enemy had driven our men into the creek, where such as could swim got across. Those that could not swim and could not procure anything to buoy them up sunk. On the opposite bank of the creek, he could make out a long row of British soldiers, professional warriors from what was then the best army in the world. They stood straight and tall in red jackets, and they fired on command and they retreated Americans, which means they pushed them back. The creek was filling up with American bodies. Joseph's company shot back furiously, trying to provide cover for those still thrashing through the water. And then they marched on to a part of Manhattan called Kip's Bay and readied themselves for yet another battle. One night they camped so close to a British warship that Joseph could overhear the soldiers on board mocking the Americans. Early on Sunday morning, Joseph slipped into an unlocked warehouse for a rare moment of privacy and peace. He was seated on a stool reading some papers he'd discovered when all of a sudden there came such a peal of thunder from the British shipping that I thought my head would go with the sound. I made a frog's leap and lay as still as I possibly could and began to consider which part of my carcass would go first. 5th grade, can you believe this? They were soon dashing for their lives, leaping over the bodies of their friends. As Joseph put it, fear and disorder seemed to take full possession of all and everything that day. Some crazy, crazy, crazy stuff that happened in our history. I'm going to go to 456. Joseph was still alive when October came and cool weather set in, and life got even more uncomfortable. To have to lie as I did almost every night on the cold and often wet ground without a blanket and with nothing but thin summer clothing. It was tedious. In the morning, the ground often was as white as snow with frost. Or perhaps it would rain all night like a flood. All that could be done in that case was to lie down, to take our guns in our arms and pack the lock between our thighs and weather it out. Now, when Joseph was discharged, when he was allowed to leave the Continental Army on Christmas Day in 1776, well, he sure felt older than 15 years old. A battle-tested patriot, he was proud that he had stood his ground against the British. He set off for home 52 miles away with 4 shillings of discharge pay in his pocket and enough stories to get him through the winter and more. He farmed for a year, he got bored, and then he re-enlisted and said he wanted to join the army again. When the war ended 6 years later, he was still a soldier, and he was also a free citizen of the new nation called America. So what happened to Joseph Plum Martin? He ended up moving to Maine in 1794, and he began to farm. He married and became the father of 5 children. He loved to write. He loved to tell stories, and he loved to draw pictures of birds. When he was 70, his Revolutionary War account was published. He died in Maine at 90 years old. Shoo, that is quite a life back in the early 1800s to live to 90 years old. All right, this next story is called Sybil Ludington. This is about a different person, and it's still going to talk to you about the war. So nearly everyone has heard about the midnight ride of Paul Revere. The British are coming, the British are coming. That's mainly because Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about it soon after it happened. But far fewer people know that 2 years later, a 16-year-old girl rode much further over rougher roads, alone and unarmed. Sybil Ludington raced through the night for freedom. So this is Sybil over here. Just after dark, on the rainy evening of April 26th of 1777, Colonel Henry Ludington, commander of the regiment of militiamen near the New York, Connecticut border, heard a rap at his door. Outside stood saluting messenger, rain streaming from his cape. His words came fast. British soldiers had just torched the warehouse in Connecticut. Food and guns belonging to the Continental Army were destroyed. Soldiers were burning homes too. Could Colonial Ludington round up his men right away? It was easier said than done. Colonial Ludington's militiamen, they were farmers, they were woodsmen, whose homes were scattered throughout the countryside. Someone would have to get them while the colonial stayed behind to organize them once they arrived. But who? Who besides he himself knew where they all lived and could cover so many miles on horseback in the dead of the night? Deep in thought, he heard his daughter Sybil's voice. She was saying that she wanted to go. Now, for Sybil Ludington, it was an unexpected chance to help the war effort. As the oldest of 8 children, her days were filled with chores and responsibility. But still, each week, when her father's men drilled into their pasture, she paused from her work to watch them. She wished she could fight. People kept saying that she was doing her part for liberty at home, but she wanted to do more. Suddenly, with this emergency on a rainy night, she actually had a chance. Her father looked at her. How could he let her take such a risk? The whole countryside was full of armed men. There were skinners and cowboys who stole cattle from the British, soldiers from both sides, and deserters trying to get back home under cover of darkness. But Sybil was right. She knew every soldier in her father's unit, and she was a fine rider. Rebecca, her next oldest sister, could mind the children. Most of them were already asleep anyways. So Colonial Ludington walked with Sybil out to the barn and held a lantern while she threw a saddle over her yearling colt Star. Together, father and daughter went over the names of his men and where they lived. Then the colonel watched Sybil disappear into the darkness. It was raining hard. Sybil put away thoughts of men, thoughts of who might appear in the roadway, and concentrated on the road map in her head. And with no time to lose, she had to reach all the men, taking the most efficient route possible. She picked up a long stick to bang on the doors, that way she wouldn't have to waste time dismounting and getting back on to Star. One by one, hearing the rap of the stick, the sleepy farmers cracked their doors open, some poking muskets out into the darkness, and Sybil said the same thing to all. The British are burning Danbury. Muster at Ludington's. Once she knew they understood, she galloped off, refusing all offers of rest and refreshment. There's the bronze statue of Sybil Ludington riding Star. It's in Carmel, New York. It took her all the way until dawn to get back home. She was soaked, she was sore, but as she rode up to her farm, she could hear the sounds of drums and bugles. Many of her father's men were already there, getting ready to march. Soon her father's militia set off to join 500 other colonial soldiers. They missed the British at Danbury, but finally fought and defeated them at Ridgefield, Connecticut a few weeks later. So what happened to Sybil Ludington? Well, words of Sybil's ride got around, and George Washington thanked her personally, and Alexander Hamilton wrote her a letter of appreciation. When she was 23 years old, she married her childhood sweetheart, Edmund Ogden, and became the mother of 4 sons and 2 daughters. She died in New York at the age of 77. There's a bronze statue of Sybil Ludington atop Star at Lake Glenada. I know that I'm not pronouncing that one right. In Carmel, New York. In 1975, an 8-cent U.S. postage stamp was issued in her Honor. All right. So that was a little bit longer of a story, but there you have it. You have a really good ability to understand better the American Revolution because we got to see it through people's eyes that really were there. Now, their biographies, so we got to learn about these people, but it sure paints a different picture than reading it out of a social studies book, especially if you have the ability to be empathetic and to think about all these people's emotions as they did what they did. All right, you guys will have a couple comprehension questions to answer to prove that you read the story, and that's all I got for you.